When thinking about what would be an appropriate talk for a pagan remembrance festival, I spent some time thinking about what common grounds there were between the two communities. What do pagans and military personnel have in common, other than the people who are members of both? The conclusion that I came to was a close relationship with nature. Now, this relationship is viewed very differently. From the pagan's perspective, it is mostly spiritual, building a positive relationship with spirits, elves, fae, and other entities associated with the land around us, caring for Mother Earth. From the military perspective, it is primarily a practical relationship, tactical exploitation of the environment to gain an advantage over the enemy. On the face of it, these two are very different relationships. Pagans ask, what can I do for nature? Whereas the military ask, what can nature do for me? But are these approaches mutually exclusive? Let's consider the roots of the pagan relationship with nature. Many modern Western pagan practices have their roots in the spiritual practices of pre-Christian Europe. For people living in this time, understanding nature was a matter of life and death. Many cultures equated the forces of nature with the acts of deities, Thor or Zeus bringing lightning storms, Neptune or Ran controlling the sea. Whether in Hellenic, Celtic, or Germanic societies, nature was the physical manifestation of the gods. It was a big part of how people believed the gods interacted with humans. A positive relationship with gods, spirits, or other beings that control nature was seen as essential to survival. Offerings were made to invoke a bountiful harvest or to protect sailors at sea. This was very much a two-way relationship. These early pagans were not respecting nature for purely spiritual purposes. They were trying to get nature to help them, or at the very least, to leave them alone and not cause them harm. Was this approach actually that different to the modern military approach of using the environment for a tactical advantage? Even well into the Christian period, the vast majority of people were far more in tune with nature than most are now. Right up until the Industrial Revolution, being able to read the signs that nature offered was a matter of survival. Knowing when it was the right time to plant seeds and when to harvest crops, seeing the signs of an approaching storm, sensing the presence of a predator, knowing where and how to hunt. These were things that were second nature to people. The relationship with nature remained even when paganism was just a distant memory in Christian Europe. It was only with industrialization that our survival started to become less dependent on our relationship with nature and more dependent on our relationship with technology. These skills that people had honed over centuries became less and less common. And slowly but surely, the Western world forgot about Mother Nature. In our society today, very few people can read nature, tracking animals, smelling a storm. Our food is delivered to the door. A device in our pocket can tell us what the weather will be doing days in advance. And for most people, a positive relationship with nature is not a matter of life and death, at least not in an immediate sense. There are some exceptions to this, and one of these is the military. Of course, we have forecasts, we have tidal data, we have maps and charts. We know when the sun will rise and set, what temperature and humidity to expect. And yet, despite all the sensors and technology we have, there will be times when it just comes down to gut feeling. Something doesn't feel right. A ship's navigator can tell that the tide isn't doing what it's expected to do. A soldier can tell that there is a weather system approaching that is different to the forecast. This instinct isn't something that is issued to you. Neither is it something that you already had. It is an understanding of nature that is developed in exactly the same way it was developed by our ancestors. Experience, whether consciously or subconsciously, developing the ability to read the signs. Because just like it was for our ancestors, for the military, our relationship with nature can still be a matter of life and death. The moments where we realise that the environment around us is not acting in the way the sensors and data have told us to expect it, is where we have to trust our instincts, and these are often split-second decisions. Trusting your own instinct when it flies in the face of what the technology is telling us does not come naturally to us these days, but the ability to do that is essential for survival. Trusting the gut feeling that wind or tide is not doing what it is expected to do can stop a ship from running aground. Noticing the natural signs of the presence of the enemy can prevent a foot patrol from walking into an ambush. Those with a greater understanding of nature have the greater chance of survival, just like it was for our ancestors. Yes, we rely heavily on sensors and technology in the military, but there is no escaping the importance of being able to tune in with our environment. The pagan relationship with nature developed out of necessity, a necessity that still exists for the military to a greater extent than it does for people in most walks of modern life. There are, of course, other exceptions, for example, the fishing industry, farming, and other professions that still rely to an extent on understanding their environment. But my point here is that whilst the pagan and military approaches to nature can on the face of it seem very different, they both exist for the same reason: survival. A core tenet of the modern pagan approach to nature that the military approach would seem to lack at first glance is the spiritual aspect. Viewing nature as a tool through a lens of technology that can be used to gain a tactical advantage seems very cold and clinical. Yet throughout history we see evidence of this spiritual element remaining. At this time of year we remember all those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in the pursuit of peace. But the First World War is given particular prevalence as Armistice Day marks the anniversary of its end. This was the first time war had been fought on an industrial scale. Rapid technological advancement meant that combatants were plunged into a conflict like nothing the world had seen before, one where nature was pushed out by barbed wire, trenches, and gas. But against this background, there is evidence of soldiers finding solace in nature, and whilst very few of them would have held pagan beliefs, they were clearly engaging with nature in a spiritual way. Lieutenant Charles Dowie of the Dorsetshire Regiment wrote of his experience on the Western Front. Those who live, as perforce we are compelled to live, exposed to sun, rain, and wind, surrounded by natural forces, in the constant presence of death, are conscious of a mystery in the heart of things, some identity of man, which gave him birth, nourishes him, and in due time receives him again. This identification of a spiritual connection with the earth itself, as giver and receiver of life, will resonate with many modern pagans. Nature also played a significant part in what soldiers in the First World War felt that they were fighting for. Often in poetry they described the fields and leafy lanes of home. This was summarised by E.B. Osborne when in 1919 he wrote, "The Englishman's profound patriotism finds its best expression in what are really acts of nature worship, worship of the various and benign nature that inhabits this fair and fortunate island." Nature worship is of course something that today is strongly associated with paganism, but here it is expressed as being an intrinsic part of the national psyche. Despite the British Isles having been Christianized for a millennium, it was, after all, still a pagan goddess that personified them, Britannia, and the understanding that she was both the land itself as well as its patron and protector was very pagan indeed, not that those who promoted her image would have admitted it at the time. Whilst on the front line itself the beauty of nature had been virtually wiped out, at the other end of the support trenches it was virtually untouched. The only evidence of the conflict raging close by, the distant sound of guns. Many soldiers wrote of the countryside they experienced. Private E. W. Parker wrote of the Somme plain behind the front line in 1916. "In these idyllic surroundings we were happy. Golden fields, rippling in the wind, healed the sight of our eyes. and the green depths of woodland shadows, like soft music, quietened the tortured nerves of our bodies. We awoke in our barns at sunrise to hear not the angry crashes of the morning stray, but the forgotten songs of birds. Much like it does for pagans today, nature was there to heal the soldiers of the Great War between periods on the front line. Bird watching was a popular pastime among British soldiers and airmen, something that continued into the Second World War. This love of birds was even portrayed in the iconic film The Great Escape, where Blythe, played by Donald Pleasant, used an ornithology class as cover for his team of forgers. There's further evidence of a spiritual connection with nature in the way Alan Ross describes the awesome power of the sea in his poem Remembrance, which describes an experience of the Arctic convoys taking supplies to the USSR in the Second World War. The snow whisper of boughs through water, asking and answer in their lift, and screw ceremonials of salt and savagery, burial of man and mermaid. On those last ski slopes, voices still murmur, Kels de Murmansk, sealings, sea eels, water skiers with lovely backs, arching or breaking. I remember the thirst of Murmansk, the great eyelids of water. Can one even see through them? The imagery of the sea consuming man and mermaid alike, and its personification in this poem, show that there was an understanding of the sea as more than just an aspect of the environment. There is a respect for the sea that alludes to a spiritual connection. There are more recent examples too. In his poem, Antipodean Sunset, Graham Caldwell describes his memories of the Falklands War. Blood-red sky, violent, silence that grips the senses, wind that cuts to the bone, but dries the flesh, sudden stillness of the sunset that calms our fears. The soundtrack of our lives haunting, sometimes vivid, clinging to a thought of a lover far away. Summer turned to winter, Antipodean stars that guide our way. These are the first two stanzas of the poem. Rather than describing the conflict itself, as he goes on to later, the poet focuses on the natural elements around him, the sky, the sunset, the stars. These are things that are noticed, that are etched in the memory. In my own experience serving in the Royal Navy, I have been to parts of the world and seen wonders of nature that no other job would have shown me. As a pagan, I've always taken the time to notice these, to watch the sunset, to explore the natural world around me when circumstances allow it. But I was not alone. Regardless of the religion or spiritual belief of my colleagues, they were often as awestruck as I was. Whether it's hearing a glacier cracking on a still night in South Georgia, bioluminescence lighting the wake of the boat, or dolphins playing in the bow wave off the Western Isles of Scotland, it's very difficult not to feel a spiritual connection to the sea when you're exposed to its power and mystery. Similarly, when you've been at the mercy of the sea, in powerful storms you feared you may not survive, it is impossible not to respect it. To me, this relationship with the sea is most definitely a spiritual one, and I know plenty of sailors of all religions or none who experience the same feelings. So whilst on the face of it, the pagan military experience of nature may seem very different, if we dig a little deeper, there is much more in common than we might think. As military personnel, we are exposed to the elements, to the power and mystery of nature, and despite all of our modern technology, I believe we are more in tune with nature than we think. Some of the instincts our ancestors had, some of the fear and respect for the forces of nature that ensured their survival, remain in those whose lives are still intrinsically linked with it. And whilst most military personnel might not think of their relationship with nature as being a spiritual one, their recorded experiences over the last century reflect thoughts and feelings towards nature that most modern pagans could relate to. As a final thought, I would like to go back to the First World War. When we think of that conflict, most of what we picture is man-made: tanks, trenches, machine guns, dreadnoughts, biplanes. But if we were asked to distill the whole thing down to one thing, one symbol, we would all say the same thing: the poppy. This symbol of hope, encapsulating endurance in the face of adversity. However savage the conflict, we can take solace in the fact that nature will always find a way. As Second Lieutenant Stephen Hewitt of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote, "The trenches, which in February were grim and featureless tunnels of gloom, without colour or form, are already overarched and embowered with green. You may walk from the ruins of a cottage, half hidden in springing green, and up to the front-line trenches through a labyrinth of Devonshire lanes."